Welcome to the Orca. Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau delivered the Trudeau government's election budget last month to mixed reviews. The budget includes record spending and another large deficit and plans to help first-time home buyers. Now, with BC real estate development slowing, there's much skepticism these new incentives will matter much in the long run. Ryan Berlin is the senior economist for Rennie, and he joins us here in the Orca studio to talk about the budget and its impact, if anything, on housing affordability in this particular area. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Rick.
You and I have talked about housing affordability in the past. What's different this time?
I mean, it's always going to be a topic. It won't go away. So it'll always be the focus of policies, particularly in an election year. And you know, I feel like right now it's an interesting time because I think as whether you're an owner or a renter, potential buyer, potential seller, it's almost like we're all kids caught between quarreling parents who are sending us mixed messages, right? Like on the one hand, we've got the provincial government here in BC, some municipal governments, the regulator of financial institutions in Canada telling us that we need to curtail our bad habits. Sort of like Buckley's. They've got the medicine. Doesn't taste good, but it'll work. And on the other hand, we have the other parent saying, "Oh, never mind that other parent. You know, they're being a bit harsh here." And this is the federal government, and they say, "We'll throw you a bone." So we have an expanded home buyer plan as part of this budget, so which allows people to access up to $35,000 from their RRSP,
correct,
to put towards the purchase of a home
if they have them.
Well, this is my point. So this is up from $25,000. So really what that particular measure, that policy is aimed at people who essentially were being held back by the fact that they could only borrow up to $25,000. So what's really material as part of that policy must be, from the federal government's perspective, is that that extra $10,000 will go a long way to helping them as a first-time home buyer access the market. I suspect that its reach will be relatively low. Though, you know, I don't think there are a lot of first-time home buyers that I don't have data on this, that are sitting around with $35,000 in their RRSP.
Correct.
And so one important feature of that, though, that hasn't been discussed that much to this point, is that the repayment terms are exactly the same as the previous home buyers plan. So if you do take out $35,000, that has to be repaid over 15 years. As did the $25,000 previously. So I think that won't have a very material impact. It's a nice gesture in an election year. The other policy is this shared equity program that CMHC will participate in for first-time home buyers, where they'll put up 5% of the value of an existing home to help a first-time home buyer access the market up to $480,000, and 10% of the value of a new home. Again, I'm not sure that this is going to have very wide reach. It's very reminiscent for people in BC. We'll remember the Liberals in their last-ditch effort to garner votes in 2017 introduced the BC Home Partnership, so the Home Ownership and Mortgage Equity Program. And the terms were very, very similar to what the federal government has just introduced. And they expected the uptake for that program to be around 15,000 people. It ended up being 3,000 people, and the NDP killed it last year. So my concern in this current environment is that, you know, we're introducing policies to affect the market, but those policies, they have their intended effect to a certain extent, but they have their shortcomings. So we introduce new policies to address those shortcomings, but of course the new policies also have shortcomings.
I thought the budget was lacking as well as incentives to developers to increase the housing stock and build the right kind of housing, which you've talked about before on this program.
Yeah, I think the federal government is fairly limited in its ability to actually incentivize housing providers to get units on the ground. I mean, I think an obvious one would be remove the GST on purpose-built rental development. But you know, I think when we talk about actually getting units built, I think we're down at the provincial and more specifically the municipal level, and the onus is on our local councils.
But there's still no real national housing policy.
There isn't. I mean, so I'm going to say something that some listeners might not like, but it's the truth, and I think it's important to just to sort of center ourselves on this. The fact that owning a home in Canada is not an inherent right. Just like driving, it's a privilege. We all expect that we should be allowed to drive, that we should maybe one day own a home.
Correct.
But I don't believe that we should be generally incentivizing people or any part of the market, any side of it, to artificially push people into home ownership. And at the same time, I don't think that we should be erecting barriers to prevent people from buying when they otherwise would. And what I'm alluding to there is the OSFI's stress test.
I'm going to say the stress test, which really took a lot of people out of the potential housing market because they simply couldn't pass the test.
That's right. And I think we can all understand where OSFI was coming from when they introduced it. It was basically to say, hey, look, interest rates are going to be going up. They're at historic lows. And we just want to make sure that when you go to renew your mortgage, the rates are likely going to be higher. We want to make sure you can afford to continue to live in your home. So I get that part of it. But I think since then we've seen interest rates come up. We've seen the Bank of Canada increase them 5 times. And so we're in a different interest rate environment now. And my problem with the stress test is its rigidity and its lack of flexibility, a recognition of different buyers in the market. So here I'm talking about people who might be coming to the table with more than a 5 or 10% down payment, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40%. And that's certainly not everybody, but there are a lot of borrowers there, or purchasers who will have that. And I think they have more skin in the game, so perhaps we should develop some sort of prorated stress tests for them. Similarly, if people are not borrowing up to a gross debt service ratio of, say, 39%, sort of that upper limit of affordability that the federal government has mandated, then perhaps again we should look at a prorated scale, and maybe we should prorate the stress test or alter it, make it flexible to reflect where interest rates are today. So this goes back to what Bob Rennie always says, which is, if borrowers are staying in their lane, let's leave them alone. And I think for most borrowers, I think mortgage arrears rate are at their historic lows. So people are paying their bills.
You mentioned interest rates, and there's a move afoot in the United States. In fact, the Fed down there is saying they probably will not increase interest rates for the next 12 to 15 months. And we hear from the Government of Canada and from the Bank of Canada that's probably going to play out here as well. How does that affect the game if we can once again see down the road 12, 15 months where there will be no interest rate increase?
Agreed. So that actually doesn't change any of my comments about making or my suggestions to make the stress test more flexible. But it is true that the interest rate environment actually in the last 3 months has changed. So we're now looking at slowing inflation, below capacity production on the part of our manufacturing segment of the economy. Consumer spending has slowed. There are some clouds on the economic horizon.
Which all add up to some economists saying, there's a possibility of recession on the horizon as well. And with recession comes job layoffs, which has to be a concern in this whole equation.
Absolutely. I think most people, generally speaking, would prefer an interest rate environment, a little bit higher interest rates with more people employed than one where interest rates are a little bit lower because a certain swath of our employment base is out of work. I suspect your view on that depends on how stable you think your employment situation is and whether or not you have a mortgage. But I think needless to say, broadly speaking, we would like more people employed rather than less. So if that comes with the cost is a little bit higher interest rates, so be it. I do think the economy is slowing. There's no specific sign that we're headed for a recession. A lot of people look to past cycles as an indication that we should be entering one. I'm not one that uses that rear view mirror approach. I see a slowdown. I haven't seen an external variable enter the equation to this point that says a recession is imminent.
A lot of what we talked about focuses on the Lower Mainland, specifically Vancouver. But when you look outside of the Lower Mainland, what's housing affordability like in the rest of British Columbia?
Well, I think if you ask most people in most markets in BC, they'd say housing is unaffordable. I mean, I think, but there's a difference between expensive and unaffordable.
Yes, very much.
So I think housing it's going to be probably your biggest, if you're lucky enough to purchase a home, it'll be your biggest purchase in your lifetime, likely. And so people don't take that lightly, and they're committing to something that they must devote a significant amount of resources to every month, and they'll be doing that until retirement. Hopefully, they'll pay off their mortgage before they retire. But people are looking at this as like a long-term commitment, and so they're very sensitive. We all are, I think, to changes in the housing market and housing prices. I think what we see is that actually on average housing is very affordable. When we look at ratios of income to housing costs, they're well below the threshold that CMHC applies as being the upper limit of
Which is what?
affordability. 30% of your gross income, before tax income, going to housing costs. So that includes your mortgage, strata fees, heating costs, everything to do with the operation of your household. Or if you're a renter, it's your monthly rent, electricity bills, etc. So on average, we're actually significantly below that 30% threshold. We're in sort of the mid-20s, low to mid-20s.
I'm surprised it's that low, frankly.
It is, on average. But that's not to say we don't have challenges, because there are segments of the population that aren't able to afford suitable housing. I think that's where, I think when we have these overarching policies that address a problem that's assumed to exist everywhere equally in all parts of all markets, we run the risk of not actually getting to the core issue, which is that there are low-income households, people working multiple jobs that cannot make ends meet, apart from ownership, have difficulty renting. So I think that's where we come back to this issue of supply and ensuring that there is a constant pipeline of new homes coming. And I say that because our region's growing. It would be a totally different story if people didn't want to live here. But we have 40,000 people a year on a net basis coming into this market. We have to be adding homes for them. So that's where we're at.
Always a pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, sir.